Now, in the years leading up to the Civil War, the farmers and plantation owners of the South had a problem. They were burning through large tracts of land at an unsustainable rate because after a few years, the same land that produced bumper crops became unproductive. And the problem was that the Southern farmers were fixated on two crops, tobacco and cotton. And both those crops depleted the soil of its nitrogen when they were planted year after year after year. And that meant that the farmers who couldn't afford to buy more land ended up living in poverty because their depleted soil produced smaller yields of cotton and tobacco every year. But the plantation owners, on the other hand, who had the wealth to do so, they were wealthy enough that they could keep acquiring large tracts of land, and they would buy slaves, the slaves they needed to keep those enterprises alive, and they would buy that land and to expand their estates, but they were running out of fresh, productive land to buy. Now, the answer to that catch-22 didn't come with the South winning the war so they could, the plantation owners could buy more land, enslave more workers, and produce more cotton and more tobacco. Rather, ironically, the answer to that dilemma came when the South lost the Civil War and they freed a slave named George. Now, George was born about the time that the Civil War began in 1861. He was born into slavery, and he was owned by a farmer in Missouri named Moses Carver. George never knew his father. He died when he was just an infant. And he barely knew his mother because he and George were carried off by raiders when he was just a baby, but George was so small and sickly that the thieves kept his mother, but they left George behind with some women at a nearby town, and the Carvers had to trade a horse to get him back. But George was a sickly child, and he was never strong enough to work in the fields, and so Mrs. Carver had him work around the house. In particular, she had him tend her garden and take care of her flowers, and she soon discovered that little George had quite a knack with plant life, and soon her flowers, her garden was flourishing, and her flower beds were the envy of her neighbors. When the Civil War ended, the slaves were freed, but George decided to remain with the Carvers, and they raised him, and they taught him to read, and they nurtured his interest in plants and flowers. And even though the Carvers were Presbyterian Christians, they never took him to church with them because, well, blacks weren't allowed to attend their church. But then one day when George was about 10 years old, a little white boy stopped by to see George while he was shelling corn in the barn. George had heard about God. He'd heard about Jesus. He heard about people worshiping in churches, and he heard about how that they prayed there. But he'd never experienced any of those things, and so he asked his friend who had come to see him what those things were like, because he went to church. And there in that barn, George's friend told him about God, told him about Jesus dying on the cross, told him what it was like to worship God in the church, and showed him how to talk to God in prayer. And George was so interested, he just kept asking question after question until finally his friend just had to go. But when he left, George got down on his knees and he opened his heart to Jesus. And that's how George Washington Carver began his lifelong walk with God. Now, George couldn't attend the local school because of the color of his skin, but he heard about a school that was 8 miles away that black kids could attend. And so when he was about 11 years old, he left the Carvers, said goodbye to them, and he walked 8 miles to where that school was, and he found a barn, and he stowed away in that barn and slept the night in it in hopes that he would be accepted into school on the next day. Providentially, a black couple owned that barn that George slept in, and when the wife found him the next morning and heard his story, she went and told her husband about George. And they were so moved that they took him in and gave him a home. And in return, George helped this woman work her laundry business, and then he helped her, and he took care of their garden and tended their flowers for them. And of course, once again, they flourished. and they became the envy of everyone in the community. But this couple who took him in, they were devoted Christians, and so they took him to church with him. And George experienced his very first worship service. And then the wife bought him a leather-bound Bible. And George read that Bible every day for the rest of his life. It was one of the last things he did before he died, is picked up that Bible and read it. Now, George was an exceptional student, and he soon outgrew the school where he was attending, and so he moved from city to city and from school to school, picking up classes until he had enough credits and classes that he could graduate from high school. But George was hungry for more, and so he applied to college in Kansas, to a college in Kansas. He was accepted, and he was supposed to start the next year, but when George showed up to register and they realized he was black, they told him he couldn't attend their school. The rejection just about destroyed George, but another Christian couple befriended him and told him about a school called Simpson College in Iowa. They believed he could go there. So he tried again, and this time he was accepted. He became the first and only black student in their college. He did so well at Simpson that the teachers encouraged him to go further. They said, "Why don't you apply to what's now Iowa State University?" They said, "I believe you could excel there." And so he took their advice, he was accepted at Iowa State, and he graduated from there with a BA. Now, while he was in college and throughout his life, George realized he really loved music. He was a great musician, and he was an exceptional artist. But he believed that he could do more good for the black community and for mankind if he got his master's degree in botany and agriculture rather than in art, and so that's what he did. And soon after he graduated with his master's degree from Iowa State, Booker T. Washington contacted George and asked him to come to Tuskegee Institute in Alabama and head up their School of Agriculture. And George accepted their offer, he poured his life into the students there at Tuskegee for 47 years. Now, when George arrived in Alabama, the Civil War had been over for 31 years. But black and white farmers of the South, they were still struggling with the same problem they were plagued with when the war started. Because they were still growing cotton and they were still growing tobacco on their depleted farms, which meant that most of the farmers in the South, whether they were black or white, were living in poverty. So George determined to help those poor farmers, to help them solve their dilemma so that they could go from poverty to thriving. But to do that, George knew that they were going to have to change the way that they exercised dominion over their farms. You see, George was a scientist, but he was also a deeply committed Christian, and therefore what he read in the Bible informed his science. For example, he knew that Adam and Eve had been given dominion over God's creation, and he knew that sin had affected the productivity of the earth. But George also knew that God was good, and he believed that God wanted to show mankind, show men and women how to unlock the productivity and the beauty of the earth so they could thrive in it. But for that to happen, they would have to listen to their Creator, and they'd have to follow His wisdom. The poor farmers and plantations owners of the South had ignored God's wisdom for 100 years. They had taken from the soil for decades without putting anything back in it to restore it. Now they were reaping the results of that. They were reaping what they'd sown, literally. And George knew that all that could change if the farmers would just listen to their Creator's wisdom, stop planting cotton and tobacco for a year and let the land rest and rebuild by planting a crop that put nitrogen back into the soil rather than taking it out. And the best crop to do that was the lowly peanut. And so George started a campaign to get the farmers in the South to let their land rest and rebuild by planting peanuts for a year on their cotton, and instead of tobacco. But then to prove that such a change would actually work to improve their land, he and his students at Tuskegee took a 20-acre piece of worthless farmland, and they produced a bumper crop of cotton on it in just 2 years by planting peanuts on that land. Well, the turnaround was so impressive to a number of farmers in the area that they followed George's advice, and they planted peanuts rather than cotton and tobacco on their fields that year to restore the soil. But there was just one problem. The land produced lots of peanuts, but there was no market for them. They could feed some of the peanuts to their livestock, but most of the peanuts that they harvested were in the storage bins and rotted while they were there because no one wanted them. So the land was restored, but the farmers languished because they didn't have a cash crop that year and no one wanted their peanuts. So George went to work in his laboratory to unlock the potential of the peanut, to figure out how the peanut could help human beings thrive on this earth. And what he discovered shocked the world, because George Washington Carver discovered that there was a lot of potential in a peanut. He discovered that you could produce peanut butter and peanut butter oil from peanuts. He discovered that you could make ink for printing and dyes for crayons and shampoo for your hair for peanuts. He discovered that you could take peanuts and make peanut butter lemon punch. You could make peanut butter chili or peanut chili. You could make peanut sausage, peanut mayonnaise. You could even make peanut coffee. You believe that? George discovered that you could use peanuts to make face powder and shampoo and insecticides and glue and rubber and charcoal and axle grease and shaving cream. He made so many things out of peanuts that he called his laboratory God's little workshop. By the time he was done unlocking the potential of the peanut, he had come up with 300 different ways that the peanut could be used to help men and women thrive upon this earth. As a result of his work, the demand for peanuts skyrocketed, which meant that when southern farmers planted their fields with peanuts, they not only restored their soil that they had systematically been destroying for decades, but they also had another cash crop that allowed them to thrive as a family. In fact, the peanut almost single-handedly saved the southern economy. In 1921, George Washington Carver was asked by the Peanut Growers of America to go to Washington, D.C. and testify before the House Ways and Means Committee and tell them about the value of the peanut industry and the need to protect southern peanut farmers from cheap imports by putting tariffs on them. So George went to Washington, but by the time he stood before the committee, the only thing that those congressmen were thinking about was wrapping up this meeting and getting home. And so they told George he had 10 minutes to make his case. So George began to show them the potential of the peanut. And the committee members were so mesmerized by what he kept telling them and showing, they just kept asking questions and extending his time. And after an hour and 40 minutes had passed, one of the chairman of the committee finally stopped and asked George, he said, "Where did you learn all these ways to use the peanut?" And Carver said, "Well, from an old book." And he said, "What book?" And Carver replied, "Well, the Bible." And the chairman inquired, "Does the Bible tell us about peanuts?" "No, sir," Carver replied. "But it does tell us about the God who made the peanuts. And so I asked him to show me what to do with it, and he did." Now today, the peanut industry has grown to a $2 billion a year enterprise and supports thousands of farmers and improves the lives of millions of people. But much of the growth of that is due to the work of a former slave named George. A man who believed that if you ignored God and exercised dominion over his creation poorly, then God would be dishonored, and as a result, God and his creation would resist you, and you would languish for your folly. But if you listen to God's wisdom and exercise dominion over his creation well, then God would be honored, and as a result, he would draw back the curtain of his creation, and he would show you the good things that he had embedded into it so you could enjoy those things and you could thrive on the earth. Now, we are currently in a series called Longing for Eden, in which we are going back to the Garden of Eden and learning the ABCs of life. And we're doing that because we're living in a time of social insanity in which everything seems to be just up for grabs. I mean, you know the deal. Where the elites of this world tell us that God's a myth, that manhood is evil, that murderers should not be punished, that work is unnecessary, that the state should parent our children, that marriage must be redefined or dismissed, that the world would be much better off if human beings just became extinct. But the same people who that tell us that a man can become a woman by putting on a dress can't tell us what a woman is. Nor can they tell us why every city and every country that adopts their foolish beliefs languishes in poverty and in crime. But one of the consequences of this social insanity is that many have started to pick up an old book called the Bible, and they've started to read it. And many have returned to church because they're longing for something ancient, something timeless, something true, something doesn't change with the whims of men, something foundational that they can build their lives and their families and their careers and their church, yes, and even their country upon. And if you're one of those people, I can tell you what you're looking for and what you're longing for are the ABCs of life, and where you'll find those foundational truths is in the Garden of Eden. Because it is in the garden that God tells us what a man is, what a woman is. It is there that we discover the virtue of work and the value of rest. It is there in the garden that we're introduced to the first marriage, witness the first worship, see the first family. And it is in the garden that we're given our first mission. Because as soon as God made Adam and Eve, he told them to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth. And as they filled it, God told them to subdue the earth and exercise dominion over his creation so they could thrive in the earth. Now, sin has made it more difficult for us to fulfill that mission, but God still expects us to subdue the earth and exercise dominion over his creation, and he still expects us to do it in such a way that God is honored, the productivity and beauty of his creation are unleashed, and he wants us to do it that way so that image bearers can thrive as they multiply and fill the earth. Now, we are given this mission because we, and we alone, no other creature on the planet, just us, bear the image of God, and therefore we and we alone have been made the managers of his creation and the administrators of his wisdom and his values and his virtues. So the reality is this: because you are an image bearer, you exercise dominion over a piece of God's creation, whether you know it or not. The only question is, are you doing it well, or are you doing it poorly? If you live in a house, if you have a lawn, if you grow a garden, if you own a pet, if you run a farm, you have dominion over a piece of God's creation. The only question is, are you exercising that dominion well or poorly? If you teach in a school, work in a business, own a company, build roads or bridges, maintain our highways, draw gas from the ground, build or rent homes, create sewage systems for communities, haul away trash, bring water to homes, manage the wealth of people, run your family home. If you're doing any of those things and 1,000 others, you're subduing a piece of this earth and exercising dominion over it. The only question is, are you doing it well or poorly? After church last Sunday, Rusty and Terrence and I jumped on our motorcycles, and we spent the afternoon riding through the back roads of West Virginia. And as we rode through the community after community, we saw homes that were well kept and cared for, with gardens that were flourishing and growing. And we saw homes that were neglected and overrun with junk and trash. Now, image bearers lived in both of those homes. One was exercising dominion well, and the other poorly. The plantation owners of the South had dominion over huge tracts of land, but they exercised their dominion over that land poorly because they enslaved image bearers to work their fields, and they ravaged the land that God had entrusted to them so they could make more money and get more land. George Washington Carver, however, produced a bumper crop of cotton on a worthless piece of land because he listened to God, exercised his dominion over a piece of God's creation well. That is, he did it in a way that honored God, unleashed its productivity, and allowed image bearers to thrive. So the question I have for you is, what piece of creation has God entrusted you with that's given you dominion over? And are you exercising your dominion over it well or poorly? And to help you answer that question, I want to take you back to the Garden of Eden and take a closer look at the mission that God gave Adam and Eve there in the garden. And then I want to scroll forward and come to the present time, and I want to see how that mission plays out in your life and mine. And so to start, we're going to start by returning back to Eden and trying to understand the mission that God gave Adam and Eve when he created them and placed them in a garden called Eden. And that brings us to this first life principle. Now, to exercise dominion over the earth, Adam had to do a couple things. He had to protect Eden, and he had to do that so he and Eve could export the wisdom and the virtues and the values of God to the undeveloped world around them. So to exercise dominion over the earth, Adam had to protect Eden, and he and Eve had to export the wisdom that God taught them there, the virtues and values God taught them there, and he wanted to export those to the undeveloped world. Now, we're told in Genesis chapter 2 that God didn't create Adam in the Garden of Eden. He created him in an undeveloped part of the world that was west of Eden, and then he created a special habitat for Adam to a place where Adam could thrive, and then he placed him in that habitat. The place where Adam was created was perfect, but because it was undeveloped, it was not a place where Adam could thrive. And so God went to a region called Eden, where a large river split into 4 smaller rivers. And God created a habitat there around those rivers, those freshwater sources, that was uniquely designed by God to sustain Adam and give him a way to thrive. And that special place that he created was called the Garden of Eden. But as soon as God placed Adam in that garden, he gave him both a job and a mission. His job was to till the garden. That is, he was to unleash the full productivity of the plants and keep it from reverting back to the undeveloped land around him. But Adam's mission was different from his job, because Adam's mission was to keep the garden. He said, I want you to till it and to keep it. Now, the word that he used for keep is a Hebrew word which means to guard or to protect something from injury or destruction. Therefore, Adam was to protect the garden from any outside force that would mar or destroy it. And here's how God described that moment when he gave Adam his job and his mission. And the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree that's in the garden, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you should not eat, for in the day that you do, you eat of it, you'll surely die. So here's my question when I read this. Here's my question. What is Adam protecting the garden from? I mean, he's the only person on the planet, right? So he's not protecting it from marauders. And sin hasn't entered the world yet, so there is no weeds creeping into the garden that needs to push out. Possibly Adam was protecting the garden from being overrun by animals who would be attracted to the garden for its abundance of food that was available there. But there's an ominous tone to this mission that God gave to Adam, because God knows that an archangel named Lucifer will soon lead a rebellion in heaven. He hasn't yet. Day 6, he says everything God made was still good. Hasn't done it yet. But God knows he's going to. He's going to lead a rebellion in heaven, and then he's going to set his sights upon the earth. And so God invited Adam to enjoy the garden and unleash the full beauty and productivity of what God had created. But he also warned Adam to keep an eye on the horizon, because trouble was coming, and God expected him to stand in the gap, because when that evil comes, he's the one who's supposed to keep it out of the garden. Now, later that same day, God gave Adam another task. He brought all the animals to him, 2 by 2, just as he would do later with Noah. And he brought them to Adam for 2 reasons. One, he wanted Adam to name them according to their nature. And second, he wanted Adam to figure out that he was unlike any of these animals that he had just named, and there was no female version of him on the earth. And once Adam figured out that he was alone, God put him to sleep. And he took a piece of living flesh from his side, and he fashioned Eve from it, and he presented her to Adam. And I think it's safe to say that Adam was gobsmacked, when he saw this creature standing in front of him. And when he could finally speak, he named her, and he said, I'm gonna call her woman. And as soon as he named Eve, called her a woman, God gave Eve a job, just like he did for Adam. And then he gave the 2 of them together, he gave them a mission that they were supposed to carry out together. Now, Eve's job was to come alongside of Adam and be his companion and co-worker there in the garden. But their joint mission was different. Their joint mission was to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, that is the earth outside of Eden. And as they do, they were to subdue that undeveloped portion of the world. And they were to exercise dominion over God's creation. And they were to do it in such a way that God was honored, and they unleashed the productivity and the beauty of God's creation, so that image bearers like them could thrive in the world outside of Eden. Here's how God said it. Then God said, let us make man in our own image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God made man in his image. In the image of God he created him male and female, both versions, male and female. He created them with the image of God. And because they bore that image, and no other creature on the planet did, because they bore that image, God blessed them, and he said to them, I want you to be fruitful, I want you to multiply, I want you to fill the earth, and as you do, as you fill the earth, here's what I want you to do. I want you to subdue it, and I want you to have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, that's a pretty simple plan. See, Eden wasn't just a place for Adam and Eve to live. It was also a laboratory where they were supposed to learn how to turn the undeveloped pieces of the earth, an undeveloped piece of the earth, into a place where image bearers like them could thrive, where they could thrive physically, where they could thrive spiritually and morally and socially, and they could live out God's virtues and God's values, the values of their Creator. Now, God had built the ABCs of dominion into the Garden of Eden, and their job was to learn those ABCs and then export what they learned outside of the garden, out into the world. Now, we don't know how big the Garden of Eden was, But if Adam obeyed God and he was fruitful and he multiplied, it wasn't going to take very long before they outgrew that garden. And people were going to have to start living outside of the garden. But if human beings were going to thrive outside of Eden, they were going to thrive physically and morally and spiritually the way that they thrived in the garden that God had created. If that was going to happen, then it was essential for Adam and Eve to learn the ABCs of dominion that God had built into the garden so they could export those treasures, God's wisdom, God's virtues, God's values into the undeveloped regions of the earth outside of the garden so they could thrive. People like them could thrive out there. It was a great plan. It was a pretty simple plan. It was a great plan. But before Adam and Eve could had their first baby and began to live out this mandate to fill the earth and take dominion over it, before they could live into that joint mission, Satan showed up and put a fly in the ointment. Because when Adam and Eve came once again to that tree that God had forbidden them to eat from, Satan was waiting for him. The only reason he was waiting for him there is because they went there a lot. He knew where they were going to be. They were going to look at that tree again. And when they showed up to look at it again, he was there waiting for them, and he tempted Eve to eat from that tree. Now, the Bible tells us that she wasn't alone. Adam was there. He witnessed the temptation, but he didn't protect his wife. He didn't protect the garden. He was supposed to keep it. He was supposed to guard it. He was supposed to protect it from evil. He didn't do it. And so she ate from that fruit. She ate from the fruit, and after she had given in to Satan's temptation, she convinced Adam to eat from some of the fruit too. And when he did, both of them were sin entered the world, and the world was changed in dramatic ways. For example, Adam and Eve's home base suddenly changed. They were kicked out of the garden, removed from it, and forced to live in that undeveloped region outside of the garden. Then the productivity of the earth also changed because the soil was now languished under the curse, and it produced thorns and thistles, which meant now it was much harder to draw out the productivity of the earth. And of course, we as human beings changed because rather than being predisposed to receive God's wisdom and believe God's truth and embrace God's virtues and absorb his values, rather than doing those things, we replace God's wisdom with folly and his truth with men's lies, and we replace God's virtues and his values with our own vices and our own opinions. The changes that happened when Adam and Eve sinned were so far-reaching, so profound, that some have insisted that our mission to subdue the earth and exercise dominion over God's creation was lost or rescinded by God. But the Bible tells us a different story. Because God's mandate to oversee creation and unleash the potential and beauty of it is repeated at least 2 more times after Adam and Eve fell. One of those times we sang about today in our worship in Psalm 8. And that tells us something. That tells us that the earth has changed. And it tells us that we have changed. But our mission has not. God is still calling upon us to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and as we do, God still expects us to subdue the earth and exercise dominion over it in such a way that we honor God, that we unleash the potential and beauty of his creation, and that we do that in a way that allows human beings, image bearers, to thrive upon this earth. In short, we are to administrate God's creation in the way that he would if he were running it. And that's why Jesus gave us this motto of dominion to pray over. He said, when you pray, this is one of the things I want you to say. I want you, when you pray, I want you to turn to God and say, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's the motto of dominion, my friends. That's the principle that guides us in this mission. God's dominion mandate still rests upon every one of us as image bearers. The only question is, are we exercising that dominion well or poorly? But here's the deal. If you want to exercise God's dominion well, you still need an Eden. You still need a place where you learn God's wisdom. You still need a place where you internalize His eternal values. You still need a place where you absorb His moral virtues. Why? So you can absorb those into your own life and then export those treasures to the piece of the world that you oversee in this world. And that brings us to our next life principle. To exercise dominion well for us today, we still need an Eden. We need an Eden so we can export God's wisdom, virtues, and values to the piece of the world that we oversee. Now, every man and woman bears the image of God, whether they know Jesus or not. And because they bear God's image, every man and woman exercises dominion over a piece of God's creation. But to exercise that dominion well, we need an Eden. We need a place where we meet with God. We need a place where we learn about His wisdom, and we internalize His eternal truth, and we absorb His moral values. And why do we need such an Eden? Because it is there that we learn the ABCs of dominion so we can export those treasures to the piece of creation that we oversee. Whether that place that we oversee is a home or a business or a medical facility or some other arena of life. Now, when you hear that, you may say, well, Steve, I'm inadequate for such a job. But if that's how you feel, you're not alone. Because King David felt the same way when he pondered that God wanted to use him, with all of his flaws and limitations, to oversee a piece of His creation. That's why he wrote Psalm 8 that we just sang about. Here's what he said in Psalm 8. He said, what is man that you're mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? We're a pretty screwed up lot, Lord. And yet, you have made him just a little lower than the heavenly beings, the angels, and you've crowned him with glory and honor. How'd you do that? By giving you His image. That's how He did that. And because He gave you His image, here's what He's doing. He's done. He said, you have given him dominion over the works of your hands. And you have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, all the beasts of the fields, the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea, and whatever passes along the paths of the sea. That's a reaffirmation of the dominion mandate of Genesis chapter 2. And He did it, thousands of years later, and in Psalm 8. Now, David grew up exercising dominion over his father's sheep, but God took him out of the agricultural world and put him in the political world, and He put him in the military world, and He put him in the architectural world, and He put him in the musical world. Psalm 8, David wrote that. It was a hymn in the worship services of Israel. It didn't matter which world that God asked David to function in. He was guided by God's wisdom, by God's eternal values, by His moral virtues, and he exported all of those things to the pieces of the world that he had dominion over. And the reason he was able to do that is because David had an Eden. He had a place where he listened to God and learned the ABCs of dominion. He had a place where he, as a worshiper, spent quality time with God. In the Old Testament, his time was called the tabernacle. Later, it was called the temple. And this is what he said in Psalm 27:4. One thing I have asked of the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in His temple. I want to go there. I want to worship God, and I want to learn important things. Why? Because God has a job for him. You see, David had an Eden. He had a place where he learned and internalized God, the ABCs of dominion, and as a result, when God asked David to exercise dominion over the agricultural world, in the political world, in the military world, in the architectural world, in the music world, in the private world of his own home. God's wisdom, God's values, God's moral virtues not only guided David's life, he was able to export these treasures into the arenas that he influenced and oversaw. And he did it in such a way that God was honored, that it unleashed the productivity and the beauty of God's creation. And he did it so that men could thrive upon the earth, thrive physically, thrive morally, thrive spiritually in their walk with God and with each other, loving God and man. Now, I don't know what areas of arenas of life you function in, but wherever you have influence, wherever you have oversight in this world, you have a measure of dominion. It doesn't matter if you have a lot of influence or a little. What matters is God has put you in a position of influence so that you can bring his wisdom, his eternal values, his virtues to that sphere of life. And God wants you to exercise that dominion in a way that doesn't build you up, but that honors God, in a way that unleashes the beauty and productivity of his creation. And the ultimate goal is to honor God and so that image bearers can thrive upon this earth. But in order to do that, if we're going to do that, we need an Eden. We need a place where we can listen to God, where we can learn his wisdom, where we can internalize his eternal values and absorb his moral values. We need a place like that. And for us today, in the New Testament, that place is a place like this. It's called a church. Because the local church, when it does its job, God says, is the pillar and the ground that upholds the truth. The local church, he says, is a light in a dark place. Remember the 7 churches of Revelation? Those were lampstands that gave light in a dark place. The church is a place where people connect with God, where they learn his wisdom, where they internalize his truth, where they deepen their grasp of God's values and they absorb his virtues. And why do they need those things? Well, so that they can live their own lives and benefit from them, but also so they can be salt and light in a dark and decaying world. So they can export those good things into the spheres where they have oversight and they have influence. And God says, I want you to do that in such a way that you honor me, that you unleash the beauty and productivity of my creation. And I want you to do that so that image bearers will thrive in the earth. Physically, morally, socially, spiritually, emotionally, thrive. Truett Cathy brought the ABCs of Eden into the world of business when he started Chick-fil-A. Christian musicians export a little bit of Eden every time into the music world every time they create a worship song. Christian teachers export Eden into the world of education when they bring Christ's wisdom and values and virtues to their classroom. I just finished a book by Josh Hawley. He's a senator from Missouri who God has brought into the political arena. And he's trying to bring the ABCs of Eden into the political world. It doesn't matter what arena you function in. God put you there to give you dominion over a piece of his creation so you can export the ABCs of God, of Eden, into that arena. And that's why God says to you, look, I want you to pray. And when you pray, this is one of the things I want you to pray about. When you pray like this, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. And what's the next thing he says? Your will be done where? On earth as it is in heaven. He didn't say just pray for your family. Just pray for your church. Just pray for a Christian organization. No, those are givens. He wants you to go way beyond that and pray that God's will be done on earth, in his creation, in the halls of government, in the boardrooms of banks and businesses, in the classrooms of schools and universities, in the fields of farmers, behind the wheels of delivery trucks, in the courtrooms of judges, in the precincts of police forces. He wants it to happen in the ranks of our military, in every podcast, every newsroom, every movie set, every talk show. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what arena of life you're talking about. God wants his will to be done there, and he's given you dominion over a piece of this world to help make that happen. But if you're going to pray that the will of your Heavenly Father will be carried out onto this earth as it is in heaven, then you got to be letting the ABCs of Eden live inside of you. You got to embrace them, because you can't export something you don't possess. But if you'll internalize God's wisdom, if you'll internalize his eternal values, if you'll absorb his moral virtues, then you can export those things to a piece of the world that you have influence over and dominion over. And God will begin to answer that prayer. And his will be done in a little piece of this earth like it is in heaven. Now, the idea that God has given us a mandate to exercise dominion over his creation excites some people, and it scares the bejeebers out of others. Because some people who are far from God assume that, you have, every time you try to share your faith with them, you're trying to subdue them and have dominion over them, because you think you have dominion over not only the earth, but over them. But nothing could be further from the truth. Because God didn't give us dominion over other image bearers. He gave him dominion to image bearers. He gave us dominion over his creation. He gave us dominion over the earth, over its mineral deposits, over its natural resources, over its plants, over its trees, over its animal life. But he didn't give us dominion over image bearers. He gave dominion to image bearers. So I want to end this message by making it clear that when you share your faith, or when you're sharing your faith with someone who is far from God, you're not trying to subdue them. You're asking them to let Jesus change their hearts so they can be reconciled to God, so they can begin to exercise the dominion that God has given them well. They're probably doing it poorly because they don't know God. And you're trying to bring them to God, give them the principles of Eden so they can do it well. And that brings us to this final point. We share Christ with lost men and women not to subdue them, but so Jesus can change their hearts so they can experience their dominion well. See, before Jesus left this earth, he gave us a commission, a command. It's known as the Great Commission. And this is what he said. Go, therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe or to do all the things I've commanded you, and behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Jesus didn't say go and subdue all the people that live in the nations. He didn't even say go subdue the nations. He said go make disciples of the people who live in those nations. And once a person places their faith in Christ, Jesus says, I want you to have them go public with their faith and baptize them. And then I don't want you just to teach them what I said. It's not what he didn't say, just teach them everything I said. No, it's not what he said. He said, I want you to teach them to observe. I want you to teach them to do everything that I've commanded. That is, I want you to teach them to live out my wisdom. I want you to teach them to internalize my eternal values. I want you to teach them to absorb and model my moral virtues. And I want you to show them how to do that in everyday life. That's not dominion, my friend. That's conversion. That's Jesus changing your heart and teaching you the ABCs of life so you can make a difference for him in this broken world by living out the dominion mandate well that God has given you. Jesus isn't interested in subduing you. He's interested in saving you and transforming your life so you can live out the purpose that you were put on this earth to fulfill. So if you haven't placed your faith in Jesus yet, gosh, why not? Why don't you just do that today? Why don't you just find a quiet place where you can talk to Jesus and bring your sins to him. Ask him to forgive you. Ask him if you can be part of his family. Ask him to start changing your life. You know, I did that in my living room. My grandfather was plowing a field, shut off his tractor, went to a farm, to a fence row, bowed down, and got on his knees, and he did that in a field, in the fence row. My wife made that decision in the back seat of her father's car. It doesn't matter where you do it. It matters that you do it. And if you're not sure how to make that step of faith, and you'd like a tool to help you make that decision, guide you through it, think through it, and then guide you on this spiritual journey so you can exercise dominion well, then just come see me right over there, right after the service. I have a book I'd like to put in your hands called Follow Me. It'll help you make that decision. Then it'll help you to grow so you can carry out your mission mandate and do the things God's asking you to do. If you're in one of our campuses, just talk to one of your campus pastors. They have copies of the book. Be glad to get it to you. Because Jesus isn't interested in subduing you. He's interested in saving you and teaching you the ABCs of Eden so your life can be transformed. And you can start exporting the truths of Eden, the principles of Eden, the ABCs of life into the spheres where you have influence and dominion in this broken world. Because creation can't fulfill its purpose until people like you unleash its potential and its beauty and its productivity in such a way that God is honored. And image bearers just like you thrive in the earth. So let's do the Father's business, okay?